Just make sure the coffee is hot and the eggs aren't runny. Specialist. That's your mission. Leave the strategic thinking to those of us with a rank to do it. The crowd of soldiers in the mess tent on FOB Vigilance snickered, a low wave of nervous amusement. Captain Davis, new to the command and eager to mark his territory, stood with his hands on his hips, his voice loud enough to carry over the clatter of metal trays. He was speaking to Specialist Eva Rostova, who was currently wiping down a stainless steel counter with methodical, circular motions. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe regulation bun, remained a mask of placid neutrality. Her focus was absolute, centered entirely on the smear of grease she was meticulously erasing from existence. The captain saw her silence not as discipline, but as insolence or worse, stupidity. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, condescending stage whisper. Are we clear, Specialist? Your battlefield is the grill. Your enemy is Salmonella. Understood. More laughter, this time a little louder, a little more confident. Rostova paused her cleaning, her hands stilling on the counter. She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, her own gaze a flat, unreadable gray. Yes, sir, she said. The words were devoid of inflection, a simple statement of fact. She had heard him. She had understood. Her part in the conversation was over. She then returned to her work, her movements economical and precise, as if the captain and his audience had ceased to exist. But on the far side of the tent, leaning against a support pole and stirring a cup of his own coffee, Command Sergeant Major Blackwood watched the exchange. He saw the captain's brittle ego and the soldier's thoughtless complicity. But when he looked at the cook, he saw something else entirely. He saw the way she stood, her weight perfectly balanced, her feet set slightly apart in a posture that was less a cook's casual stance and more a shooter's stable platform. He saw the way her eyes, even while focused on her task, scanned the entrances to the tent without her ever moving her head. He saw a profound and unnerving stillness, a calm that didn't belong in a field kitchen. And a memory, decades old, stirred in the back of his mind. The memory of another soldier with that same impossible calm, right before the world had erupted in fire and steel. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type competence below. Captain Davis, pleased with the ripple of subservient laughter his public dressing down had created, turned his attention to the broader assembly of troops. He launched into an impromptu speech about standards, about vigilance, about the importance of every cog in the military machine knowing its place and function. He used metaphors involving chains and links, pyramids and foundations, all designed to subtly reinforce his own position at the apex. All the while, Specialist Rostova continued her duties, moving from the counter to the large industrial mixers, her rhythm unbroken. She was a ghost in her own workspace, present but unseen, her existence acknowledged only as a function, not as a person. The soldiers, taking their cue from their new captain, began to treat her as part of the mess hall's machinery. They would slide their trays toward her without making eye contact, mumbling more potatoes or a scoop of corn, as if speaking to a dispenser. Her quietness, once just a personal trait, was now interpreted as a sign of her lowly station, a confirmation of the captain's judgment. She never corrected them. She never offered a sharp word or a sigh of frustration. She simply served the food, her hands steady, her expression unchanging. This ritual of casual disrespect became the new normal over the next several weeks. Captain Davis would often make a point of stopping by the serving line to offer some backhanded compliment or thinly veiled critique. Specialist, I see you've managed not to burn the toast today. Progress, he'd say with a smug grin. Each time, her response was the same, a quiet yes, sir, or understood, sir, delivered with the emotional resonance of a computer acknowledging a command. Her silence became a canvas onto which they all projected their own assumptions. To Davis, it was the silence of a simple mind. To the young privates, it was the silence of someone who knew her place. To the NCOs, it was the silence of someone who just wanted to do her time and get out. None of them saw the truth. None of them understood that her silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the silence of observation, of patience, of a profound and disciplined waiting. She was a loaded weapon with the safety on, and her calm was not the absence of energy, but the perfect containment of it. She was listening to the hum of the base generators, feeling the vibration of distant patrol through the soles of her boots, and watching the suns arc across the sky, noting the shifting shadows and the barren landscape beyond the perimeter wire, shadows where a threat might one day emerge. The first mortar round landed 300 meters south of the wire, a dull, percussive thump that was more felt than heard. It was the standard morning harassment, the enemy's way of saying good morning. Most soldiers barely looked up from their breakfast. The second round, however, landed just inside the perimeter, sending a geyser of sand and shrapnel into the air and shattering the morning's complacency. The third one struck the communications array on the roof of the Tactical Operations Center, and with a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the world went silent. All comms, internal and external, were gone. It was in that sudden, terrifying vacuum that the real attack began, a coordinated assault from 3 directions, the rhythmic chatter of machine guns mingling with the screams of the wounded. In the mess hall, chaos erupted. Soldiers flipped tables for cover, fumbling for weapons, their training kicking in with a surge of adrenaline and fear. Captain Davis, his face pale, barked orders that no one could hear over the din, his voice a thin thread against the tapestry of violence. But Specialist Rostova did not take cover. She moved. While everyone else was reacting to the noise, she was reacting to the silence that preceded it. The moment the comms tower was hit, she was already in motion, her actions fluid and devoid of panic. She vaulted over the serving counter, her movements impossibly agile. She grabbed a medkit from the wall, her hands not shaking in the slightest. A young private was down near the exit, clutching a leg that was bleeding profusely from a shrapnel wound. Rostova was on him in a second. She didn't speak. She simply tore open his pant leg, assessed the wound with a clinical glance, and applied a tourniquet high on his thigh, cinching it with practiced, brutal efficiency. The private cried out, but she was already packing the wound, her fingers working with a surgeon's precision. She then moved to the next casualty, and the next, a silent whirlwind of competence in the heart of the storm. Captain Davis, trying to rally a fire team near the shattered entrance of the mess hall, saw her. He saw the cook, the woman whose only mission was to avoid runny eggs, performing advanced battlefield triage with a calm that bordered on supernatural. He watched as she improvised a splint for a broken arm, using 2 serving spoons and a roll of duct tape. He saw her clear a soldier's airway, her movements swift and sure. For a moment, his mind refused to process the image. It was a glitch in his understanding of the world, a fundamental violation of the neat, orderly hierarchy he so cherished. But the evidence was undeniable. As rounds stitched across the wall above his head, forcing him to duck, he saw Rostova rise. She wasn't looking at the wounded anymore. She was looking past them, toward the crippled TOC building. Her expression had changed. The placid mask was gone, replaced by a look of intense, analytical focus. She scanned the battlefield as if it were a diagram, her eyes tracking the arcs of tracer fire, identifying the sources of the heaviest enemy assault. Then, without a word to anyone, she began to run. Not a panicked scramble, but a low, purposeful sprint, using the very tables that others were hiding behind as cover, moving from one point of concealment to the next with the practiced grace of a predator. She was heading directly for the heart of the command failure, the silent TOC, running into the fire that everyone else was desperately trying to escape. Davis could only stare, his mouth agape, a single, disbelieving thought cutting through the noise in his head. Who is she? The cook was gone, and in her place was a soldier, a warrior moving with an intent so powerful it was terrifying. The universe, as he knew it, was beginning to unravel. CSM Blackwood was already at the TOC, or what was left of it. The blast had gutted the interior, and the command staff were either wounded or trying to put out the electrical fires that had erupted. The radios were dead. The screens were blank. They were blind, deaf, and cut off. Blackwood knew that in a situation like this, the first 10 minutes would determine whether the FOB stood or fell. It was then that he saw her burst through the doorway, Specialist Rostova. She was covered in dust, a smear of someone else's blood on her cheek, but her eyes were clear and sharp. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't ask for permission. She moved directly to the auxiliary power conduit, a place most people didn't even know existed behind a false panel. With a practice motion, she ripped the panel away, revealing a tangle of wires. Her fingers flew, bypassing fried circuits, rerouting power with an electrician's skill. "We need the long-range tactical radio," she said, her voice the first thing Blackwood had heard her say all morning. That wasn't "yes, sir." It was a command, not a request. "The primary antenna is slag. The backup is on the MATV in Bay 4. I need a fire team to get me there." Blackwood didn't hesitate. He grabbed the two ablest soldiers near him. "You're with her. Go!" As they moved out, a hail of gunfire erupted from the west, pinning them down. An enemy machine gun nest, cleverly positioned in a rocky outcrop, had them zeroed. It was a perfect kill zone. Rostova didn't even flinch. She pointed. "There, 200 meters. Suppressing fire is ineffective. We need precision." She looked at the fallen security NCO at her feet, then knelt and gently took the M210 enhanced sniper rifle from his grasp. She checked the chamber, slapped the magazine to ensure it was seated, and crawled to a fortified window, all in one seamless, fluid motion. The captain, who had followed her, watched in utter disbelief as the mess hall cook expertly adjusted the scope's windage and elevation knobs, her lips moving in a silent calculation. The moment was suspended in time. The cacophony of the battle seemed to fade into a dull roar, a distant backdrop to the intense, focused drama unfolding at the window of the ruined TOC. Specialist Rostova settled the stock of the M210 rifle into the pocket of her shoulder. Her movements were a study in absolute economy, with not a single twitch or wasted motion. She didn't just hold the rifle. She became an extension of it. Her left hand supported the forestock, her fingers gently cradling the weapon, not gripping it. Her right index finger rested lightly on the trigger guard, not the trigger itself. CSM Blackwood and Captain Davis watched, mesmerized. They saw her breathing change. She inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly, and in the natural respiratory pause that followed, her body became as still as the stone wall she was using for support. It was the technique of a master marksman, a skill honed over thousands of hours of relentless practice, not something learned in a culinary course. The enemy machine gunner was unleashing a long, sustained burst, the tracer rounds kicking up dust just meters from their position. To everyone else, it was terrifying chaos. To Rostova, it was a predictable rhythm, a pattern of fire she could analyze and exploit. She made one final minute adjustment to the scope. Then, her finger moved from the guard to the trigger. There was no jerk, no sudden pull. Just a slow, steady application of pressure, a gentle squeeze that seemed to take an eternity. The rifle cracked, a single, sharp report that was utterly distinct from the surrounding noise. It wasn't the frantic bark of an automatic weapon. It was the deliberate, authoritative voice of pure precision. 200 meters away, the stream of tracer fire from the enemy nest instantly ceased. A collective breath was held. Then, a cheer erupted from the defenders in that sector. The threat was gone. Rostova worked the bolt on the rifle with practiced smoothness, ejecting the spent casing, her eyes already scanning for the next target. She had not just fired a weapon. She had solved a complex tactical problem with a single, perfect action. In the deafening silence that followed the shot, Captain Davis finally found his voice, a choked whisper of pure, unadulterated awe. That's not possible." CSM Blackwood turned to him, his face grim, his eyes burning with an intensity Davis had never seen before. "Son," the sergeant major said, his voice low and dangerous, "you have no idea what's possible." With the primary threat neutralized, the tide of the battle began to turn. The fire team, now free to move, reached the MATEV and, under Rostova's clear, concise instructions, managed to get the backup radio online. Her voice cut through the static, a beacon of calm authority. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a natural leader, a force multiplier. She coordinated defensive sectors, directed medical teams to the most critical casualties, and relayed a sit rep to headquarters that was so clear and accurate it could have been written for a textbook. By the time reinforcements arrived, the worst was over. The attackers were in retreat, leaving behind a field of their own fallen. FOB Vigilance had held, but not because of its command structure or its defensive plans. It had held because of a cook. As the dust settled and the last echoes of gunfire faded, a strange quiet fell over the base. Medics moved among the wounded, and teams began the grim task of assessing the damage. CSM Blackwood walked directly to a still-functioning terminal in the corner of the TOC. Captain Davis, looking dazed and humbled, followed him like a lost child. Blackwood's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced speed, accessing the personnel database. He typed in Rostova's service number. Her file appeared on the screen. Davis leaned in, his eyes scanning the data, and the color drained from his face. The file was heavily redacted, large sections blacked out with classified stamped over them. But what was visible was enough to shatter his entire worldview. Name, Rostova Eva. Rank, Specialist, Administrative Reduction. Primary MOS, 18D, Special Forces Medical Sergeant. Secondary MOS, 18B, Special Forces Weapons Sergeant. The list of qualifications scrolled on. Special Forces Qualification Course, Honor Graduate. SEER School, High Risk. Advanced Sniper Course, Top Shot Award. Combat Diver Qualification Course. Military Free Fall Parachutist School. The list of deployments was a tour of the world's most dangerous and forgotten conflicts. Her awards included a Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with V for Valor, and a Purple Heart. The last entry before her transfer to Food Services was a mission report, almost entirely redacted, titled Operation Phantom Scythe. CSM Blackwood printed the public-facing portion of the file, his face a mask of cold fury. He walked out of the TOC and into the sunlight, where Specialist Rostova was quietly helping a medic clean a wound, her hands as gentle and steady as they had been on a rifle. The entire command staff, the surviving NCOs, and dozens of soldiers were gathered, their faces a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and confusion. They were all looking at Rostova, whispering, trying to reconcile the woman who served them lumpy oatmeal with the angel of death who had saved them all. Blackwood strode into the center of the crowd, Captain Davis trailing in his wake. He held up the paper. "Listen up," his voice boomed, silencing the murmurs. "You all owe your lives to this soldier. And for the last 6 weeks, some of you have treated her with less respect than the dirt on your boots." He turned his gaze directly on Captain Davis, and the captain visibly flinched. Blackwood didn't need to say his name. The accusation was clear. He then turned to face Rostova. He stood before her, his back ramrod straight. In a gesture of profound, almost shocking respect, the highest-ranking enlisted man on the base, a living legend with 30 years of service, brought his hand up in a salute so sharp and precise it could have cut glass. "Sergeant First Class Rostova," Blackwood said, his voice thick with emotion, deliberately using her former, true rank. "On behalf of every soldier on this FOB, thank you. Your command has been reinstated, effective immediately, pending review by battalion. We are in your debt." Rostova looked at the command's sergeant major, her expression softening for the first time. She slowly rose to her feet, wiped the blood from her hands on her trousers, and returned the salute, her own form just as perfect, just as disciplined. "The mission continues, Sergeant Major," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The assembled soldiers stared, dumbfounded. Then, one by one, they too began to salute, a wave of respect washing over the compound, a silent, powerful apology for their ignorance. Captain Davis stood frozen, his hand half raised, his face a portrait of utter, soul-crushing shame. He had dismissed the most competent soldier on the base because she was wearing a cook's uniform. The story of the Battle of FOB Vigilance, and more specifically, the story of the chef, spread not like wildfire, but like a slow-burning, deeply penetrating heat that warmed the very culture of the base. It was told in hushed, reverent tones in the barracks at night. It was whispered over the low hum of vehicle maintenance bays. The details became legend. The way she had applied a tourniquet with one hand while directing fire with the other. The impossible shot that had silenced the enemy machine gun. A shot that was now simply referred to as the Rostova shot. The spent .308 casing from that round was found, polished to a high sheen by a grateful infantryman, and mounted on a small, hand-carved wooden plaque. It was hung on the wall of the mess hall, directly over the serving line where Captain Davis had once berated her. The plaque read, "Fob Vigilance." The day the chef taught USTOC, Captain Davis, to his credit, did not try to hide from his shame. The next morning, at the daily formation, he stood before the entire company. His voice, once so full of arrogant confidence, was quiet and strained. "Yesterday," he began, his eyes fixed on Rostova, who stood in the front rank, "I failed as a leader. I judged a soldier not by their character or their competence, but by their assigned duty. My ignorance put this base at risk. My arrogance was a disgrace to this uniform." He took a deep breath. "Specialist Rostova, Sergeant Rostova, I was wrong. I apologize. I ask for your forgiveness." It was a stunning, public admission of fallibility. Rostova simply gave a short, sharp nod of acceptance. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a calm, professional acceptance. Her vindication needed no embellishment. The lesson had been learned. From that day forward, the entire dynamic of the FOB shifted. The mess hall was no longer just a place to eat. It became a place of quiet respect. Soldiers lined up for their food and addressed Rostova as Sergeant, even though her official rank on paper was still Specialist. They didn't just ask for food, they asked for advice. Young riflemen would quietly approach her while she was wiping down counters, asking her about breathing techniques for marksmanship. Medics would consult her on difficult cases, deferring to her 18D background. She became the base's unofficial mentor, a living embodiment of the quiet professional. She never lectured. She never boasted about her past. She would simply offer a small, precise piece of advice, demonstrate a technique, and then go back to stirring a massive pot of chili. Her humility was, in its own way, more intimidating and more inspiring than any metal-laden uniform. She taught them that leadership wasn't about the volume of your voice, but the depth of your knowledge. She showed them that true authority was not granted by a piece of metal pinned to a collar, but earned through undeniable competence in the crucible of crisis. Captain Davis became her most diligent student. He followed her, observed her, and learned from her. He stopped making grand speeches and started listening. He was a changed man, humbled and reshaped by the quiet cook who had been a titan in disguise. The base was safer, the soldiers were sharper, and the morale was higher than it had ever been. It was a transformation bought with blood and humility, a legacy forged not in the commander's office, but over a hot grill by a woman who understood that the most important battles are often won in silence. Months later, a new rotation of troops arrived at FOB Vigilance. As they filed into the mess hall for their first meal, a young, cocky lieutenant, fresh from officer candidate school, made a loud joke about the quality of the food he was expecting. Before he could finish his sentence, a grizzled master sergeant who had been there during the attack stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The sergeant didn't raise his voice. He simply pointed a thumb toward the plaque on the wall, the one with the gleaming brass casing. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low and serious, "you're about to be served by a living legend. I suggest you remember your manners and address her as Sergeant in this mess hall. We don't judge people by the apron they're wearing." The young officer, confused but intimidated by the sheer gravity in the sergeant's tone, fell silent. He watched as the unassuming woman behind the counter served food with a quiet efficiency, her movements calm and deliberate. He saw the profound respect in the eyes of every soldier who passed her, from the lowest private to the base commander. The story of that day had become more than just a memory. It had become doctrine. It was the first lesson taught to every newcomer. Look past the uniform, beyond the rank, and recognize the competence that lies within. The tale of Sergeant Rostova, the Special Forces operator who had traded her rifle for a ladle to find a measure of peace, had become a foundational myth of FOB Vigilance, a constant reminder that heroes are not always the ones who stand on podiums. Sometimes they're the ones who stand quietly in the background, waiting for the moment they are needed, their silence a testament to a strength that requires no announcement. The legacy of that single day was not written in after-action reports or official commendations. It was written in the changed behavior of hundreds of soldiers. It was seen in the way they double-checked their equipment, the way they listened more intently during briefings, the way they treated every single person on the base, from mechanics to the intelligence analysts, with a newfound respect for their hidden skills. Rostova's quiet competence had infected the entire command. She had taught them that excellence was a habit, that professionalism was a mindset, not a job title. When her time at FOB Vigilance finally came to an end, there was no grand ceremony. She simply packed her duffel bag one morning and walked toward the helicopter that would take her back to the world of shadows she had come from. Captain Davis and CSM Blackwood were there to see her off. Davis, now a far better officer than he had been, simply shook her hand. "Thank you, Sergeant." "For everything," Rostova nodded. "Just do the work, Captain. The rest takes care of itself." As the helicopter lifted off, kicking up a storm of dust, she didn't look back. Her work there was done. The true legacy of a soldier isn't what they take with them, but what they leave behind. Eva Rostova left behind a stronger, wiser, and more humble base, an institution forever marked by the lessons she had taught without ever intending to. She had proven that respect is not a function of rank or title, but a direct result of demonstrated worth. True strength is quiet. True competence is undeniable. And true honor is found not in the noise of self-promotion, but in the silent, steady execution of one's duty. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.